We made it. So this was originally just one session, but it's now split into two, partly because I couldn't get it to fit into an hour slot. So you might think it was a bit elaborate to organise a volcanic ash cloud just because I couldn't get my material to fit into 1 hour, but it seemed to have worked. So what we're talking about today is kind of application lifecycle management and SharePoint 2010. And really one of the things that we're looking at is, okay, so we've done some development of a SharePoint 2010 application. How do we make changes to it? How can we upgrade that once it's in use? So there's perhaps something a little bit strange about that, given that most of us might not have done a SharePoint 2010 application. But we're here to learn about the new things in SharePoint 2010. And the stuff that we're looking at today is one of the things that we're going to deal with at some point. So a little bit about me. My name is Chris O'Brien. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I blog at sharepointnutsandbolts.com, and that's my Twitter alias. In terms of this topic, you might remember that last release, for the 2007 release, a lot of the MVPs came together and wrote a book. This time round, we're doing the same again, and I'm writing the chapter about application lifecycle management in the book. So I expand there on a lot of the stuff that we're talking about quite quickly today. And you might know me from kind of speaking at other UK events. Okay, so let's take a minute to define application lifecycle management. Now, ALM is a big topic. There are entire conferences dedicated to ALM. And the way I think about it is really it's about considering all the aspects of an application throughout its life cycle. So not just the initial build phase, but also going beyond that and making changes to it once it's in use. Now, really a key element of ALM is about how we manage change and how we deploy updates whilst maintaining the integrity of the system that we've got. And I think it's fair to say that SharePoint is exceptionally complex, really. It's a really complex platform with a lot of moving pieces. And you often find .NET developers that when they come to SharePoint, they're often a bit dismayed that they can't just X-copy files from A to B to update their application. But we know that it's more complex than that. We've got bits in the database, we've got bits on the file system, and they need to be in sync in order for things to work right. So, in terms of what we're looking at in the two sessions, in this session, we're going to spend some time thinking about the initial build, and in particular, feature development. So both of these sessions talk a lot about features, and I hope that as SharePoint developers, that's a concept that you're pretty familiar with. It's the vehicle that we use to deploy functionality. So we'll talk a bit about feature development in 2010, and we'll look at some new techniques for obtaining the feature XML that you might use. We'll also spend a minute kind of talking about options for features. So whether you build features which are XML-centric, with lots of XML, or features that are code-centric, and we do lots of provisioning in C# code rather than XML. Beyond that, we then think about upgrading the application. So what are the things that we can do to make changes to a SharePoint 2010 application? And the big thing that we look at here is the new support for upgradable features in SharePoint 2010. And how we can kind of do versioning now for features and kind of manage upgrades. And there's a couple of options there. Again, we can use code or we can use XML. So in the demos, we'll take a look at one each and we'll show the various routes to upgrading. So that's today. Next session, sorry, that's wrong. It's not Wednesday at 2 o'clock anymore. It's tomorrow at 11:45 a.m. So tomorrow, we're going to look at how do different artifacts upgrade? So let's say that we've got, say, a content type, or a list template, or a list instance. Those are all very different things internally to SharePoint. SharePoint does different things with them, and they have different upgrade characteristics. So we'll take a look at all the artifacts in SharePoint and think about exactly what we would need to do if we need to change a list instance or a list definition that's already in use. So after today's focus on features, tomorrow we start to think about solutions, and we think about changes there, and what's new in the WSP framework, and how that might help us as developers. We also take a look at assembly versioning in 2010. Now, I just want to test a quick poll, right? I want to test a theory out on you. So in terms of assembly versioning in SharePoint, my theory is that 90% of the world's SharePoint 2007 installations all the custom assemblies are still at version 1000. Right, so put your hand up if you have done proper versioning in 2007. Okay, so there's a few, not many. Okay, so I think that what you would have needed to do that is to use binding redirects. And that's one of the things that we talk about tomorrow, and we look at SharePoint 2010's improved support for assembly versioning. So the two sessions, we kind of wrap them up with some versioning recommendations, both in terms of versioning features and also versioning assemblies. So it's a bit like some guidelines going forward for this brave new world of versioning in SharePoint. Okay, so in today's stuff, let's think about then the initial build for a minute. And really, we've got this decision when we come to build features about whether we do things that are XML-centric. And by that, I mean features that are typically using kind of the classic route for features. I'd say that 90% of the MSDN samples, for example, use XML-centric features. But the alternative is to write code. And I think that there's been kind of a bit of a movement more recently to using code to deploy our code, using code to deploy our artifacts. So we might kind of write code to create lists, to create content types, to create views, whatever our application needs. Rather than use XML, let's write it in C# code. And I think that there are some benefits to this. The people that do it, I think the things that they like are the fact that you can debug provisioning. You can put a breakpoint in Visual Studio and kind of pause and look at variables and do all the things that you can do in normal debugging whilst your site is being created. And when you do it the other way, it's kind of SharePoint's black box. You can't really get in there and see what's happening. So if you've got some problem, it can be difficult to diagnose. One of the other benefits is that you get more control over the sequencing. You know, we've got this kind of internal SharePoint code which processes the XML in site definitions and features. But when we kind of step outside that and write code to do provisioning, we end up with more control over the order that things execute, and we can kind of solve all the problems that can sometimes cause us issues going the other way. Now, the thing that I think about is that if you know, in 2007, you needed to write code to upgrade a lot of artifacts. If you think about a content type, so you could define that in XML and you could push that out and get it in use. But Microsoft always said that to make upgrades to that, you then have to write code. So something that I always talked about is, well, if you need to write code to upgrade it, then why not just write code to provision it in the first place? And then you've got everything kind of in one methodology. So these are the kind of things that are often discussed in this decision about whether to use XML or code. I think you've got to bear in mind that whichever route you try and take, you'll never end up with 100% of one thing and 0% of the other. So if you try and do things in code, you're always going to need some things kind of based in XML or templates on the file system. So things like site definitions, list templates, you can't do those things in code. SharePoint will always want some kind of template in the SharePoint route to use something like that. Now, if you were here at my talk this time last year, you might remember that I demoed a super cool SharePoint code generation tool called Kivati, where it would kind of, you'd have a workflow designer, and it would basically generate your provisioning C# code. Now, this tool seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth, so maybe that isn't the way forward after all. And if there's any other vendors in the room that want me to put the kiss of death on their product, then just let me know. Okay, so let's say that you are in the initial build then of your project. You are developing features and you've decided to do the classic thing, which is to use lots of XML. How do you go about that? Well, in 2010, we've got kind of better startup support from Visual Studio. So it will often put some starter XML in the files for us, and we just have to kind of fill in the blanks. And that's definitely something that's a step forward, definitely helpful. And if you use CKS Dev, which is the kind of the community extensions for Visual Studio, they go beyond that and again give us even more XML, which is definitely useful. I think the thing that most of us do though as SharePoint developers is when we need the XML for some fields or for some content types, really we're going back to the last project and we're copying and pasting and doing some new GUIDs and changing some titles and things like that. Or we do some Google-driven development and grab something off the internet. and drop that in and change what we need to change. So that's kind of good, but in 2010, we've got a new approach that you might find useful. So a new way to get some of this complicated XML. What we can do in 2010 is we can create a site in the browser, and maybe with SharePoint Designer, do some customizations there. We can save it as a site template, and because that now saves a WSP rather than an STP, which has kind of gone away, we can use that WSP. Even better, in Visual Studio 2010, we can import the WSP that we just created, and it will basically disassemble it and create us a Visual Studio project with all those artifacts. So this can be a quick way for you to get XML that otherwise you would have to find elsewhere. So we'll take a look at that in a minute, but before we go and take a look at that in a demo, I just want to talk about some things, some changes in the feature framework that Microsoft have had to introduce to support that kind of loop that we can go around now. Okay, so first thing is that we've got 5 of these changes. Okay, first one is event receivers. We can now deploy event receivers to a specific list declaratively. That's something that we couldn't do in 2007. We had to use code to do that. So this is possible because we've got some new attributes like the list URL attribute, and that enables us to say, I want to bind this receiver to this specific list. Previously, when we're using XML, all we could do is bind to a content type or a list template using the list template ID. So that's change number 1. We've got these new property bag elements. These allow us to write to property bags. I'm not sure if we can go to farm and web app property bags. I haven't tested that. But anything below, so site collection, web, you can do something specific to the property bag on a root web, list and list item. We can now kind of set values in property bags declaratively. One interesting thing here is that you can use this to set list item values. So it's a bit like if the list item effectively has a property bag, and you can use this construct to write data into it, which will overwrite list item values on existing list items. Workflow associations, that's something we can now do declaratively. Again, we could only use code in the past to provision those. Web template is a new element, and this is kind of like a site definition which had a configuration that was specific to webs. So you might remember that site definitions, you often have different configurations, maybe one for a site collection and one for a web. This is similar to the latter, where it's basically a template that is used for webs, and it's something different to the site definition construct. The reason Microsoft had to create this is because site definitions live in the SharePoint root. Microsoft wanted something that could be used as a web template within the sandbox. So you might have learned already that the sandbox cannot touch the file system. It cannot call out to lots of external APIs and things like this. So this allows you to have web templates, but in the sandbox. Finally, custom action, which is the element that we use to kind of provision links into various places in SharePoint. That's been expanded quite significantly, mainly based around ribbon customizations. And if you read my blog, there's some detailed articles on there about using custom action to customize the ribbon. One other thing that you can use custom action for is to add some JavaScript to all the pages in your site collection. So this is kind of if you've used additional page head as a way to get JavaScript onto your pages, then this is an alternative to that, and obviously you can include it in a feature which can be deactivated and reactivated, so that could be something useful. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at this loop then, this way of potentially obtaining XML quite quickly in the virtual machine. Okay, so I've got a fairly plain SharePoint 2010 site. I know the text's small at the back and you can't really read it. It doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that this is a blank site. It's got some content in that I've quickly pasted in from my blog, and it's got a couple of pages, and it's got a list view web part on here, which kind of provides some poor man's navigation. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly save this as a site template. Go to the Save as Site Template in Site Settings. Call this COB blog. And I'm going to tick the box to include the content. Okay, so that's saving everything in the site, every artifact like a column or a content type, but also every piece of content like a list item or a list or a web. Everything in there is being saved into a WSP. Now the WSP ends up in the solution gallery, which is the new site scoped gallery that WSPs can go in. What I'm going to do is download that. And I've got a couple of test ones there. So the one that we're using now is CLB blog WSP. I want you to remember that. And then in Visual Studio 2010, what we'll do is we'll import that. So I select the project type, which is for importing SharePoint solution packages. I'll just call this CLB blog. Okay, so Visual Studio is asking me whether I want a sandboxed or a farm solution. Doesn't really matter for our purposes here. CLB blog is the one that we just saved. Okay, so we've selected the WSP now. Visual Studio is analyzing the WSP and it's looking for all the artifacts in there. It's going to present me with a dialog for me to pick out bits that I want. Okay, so it's found all the things in the WSP, and you might not be able to see the dialog at the back, but basically it's broken down and given me a checkbox for every artifact in the WSP. So we've got content types, we've got fields, we've got a lot of fields, we've got modules, receivers, web templates, things like that. There's a bit of a gotcha in this dialog that you might notice there's no checkbox at the top to select everything or deselect everything. But the trick is basically to select multiple things with Shift, and then if you tick one of the tick boxes, it's going to uncheck them all and check them as a group. So I'm happy to import everything for now. So we'll click Finish there. Now Visual Studio is creating a Visual Studio 2010 project with all those artifacts in from the WSP. That just takes a couple of seconds to churn through. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got. So we've got some features, if I zoom in. We've got some features, not very well named features, but we've got features nonetheless. We've got some built-in list instances, and we've got some content types. Now, if I scroll down and just look at some of this stuff that we ended up with, I need to zoom back out, unfortunately. We see that, wow, we've got a hell of a lot of content types. And what's happening here is that the process isn't really giving you just my customizations. It's giving you every last nut and bolt that was in that site. So it kind of doesn't account for the site definition and what it provisioned. It's basically giving you everything. So it isn't the easiest thing to work with, to be honest. And you find that you kind of have to wade through all the artifacts that ended up here. So if we just kind of delve in a bit deeper, if we look at fields, we've got one big field. My font gone down. Sorry, let's bump that up. Oh, I'm already fairly big. There we go. Okay, so we've got one big field, one big file with all the fields in. So again, not the easiest thing to work with, but our XML that we might be looking for would be in here somewhere. So I'm not sure why they chose to put it all in one file rather than separate it out, but that's what we've got for fields. We've got lots of content types, as we say. And the thing that you notice with the content types is we've got all of the out-of-the-box ones. We've got announcement, administrative task, and so on. So those aren't content types that I put into that site. They were just there. So these are the kind of caveats you've got to be aware of with this process. If we go looking around a bit further, we see things like event receivers using kind of that new construct that we talked about there. So those are event receivers being bound to a list. We've also got some property bag stuff. So here, this is setting some metadata on a folder. And again, that's one really big file. But somewhere down the bottom, it will be setting metadata on list items. Now, the cool thing about this is that, so we've got a WSP here. I can then make some changes to that, and I can redeploy it. I can just press F5 and redeploy it. I can even redeploy it back to the same site. So we can kind of we can go around a round trip here and kind of make further changes, save it as a site template, and then import WSP, make further changes in Visual Studio. You can go around that loop as many times as you want, and it works surprisingly well. So this can be a fairly quick way then for you to get the XML for some artifacts. So if you want some XML for a content type, why not create it through the browser very quickly? It's probably the quickest way to do it. Save it as a site template, then chop the bits out for that XML. Could be useful to you. So we could wander around that for a bit longer, but let's go back to the slides and we'll just think about some of the things that we've seen there. Okay, so some gotchas, some things to be aware of with this process. As we've seen, all the out-of-the-box site definition artifacts are included, and we would have to kind of pick our way through those to the things that we want. Unfortunately, it isn't full fidelity. There are some things that are not supported with this. Microsoft have a list on MSDN. It can't do things like BCS entities. It can't do code workflows. Now, code workflows I'd kind of expect, actually. I'm not sure I'd expect it to disassemble and produce me some kind of C# class, so I can live with that. List and site definitions are apparently things that aren't supported there, so we need to be aware of that list. The big kicker, it's not supported to import a 2007 WSP, and it's kind of not widely known at the moment that you can't do that. I see a lot of people in forums that think you can. There's one single page on MSDN that tells you that that's not supported. So if you were thinking that this might be a good way to upgrade your Visual Studio projects from 2007 to 2010, you have to discount that as an option, unfortunately. Now, if you were to try it, you would find that it will probably work. It will import the WSP successfully. You will probably even be able to deploy that WSP successfully. But chances are you will have some latent problem in that site that will take you a long time to find out. And then when you dig down to the bottom of it, you'll find that it could well be caused by the fact that you started out with a 2007 WSP. And then you'll take it out on the dog. Other things, okay, so consider this. Consider that if we do go around this round trip, let's say that we build some stuff in the browser and in SharePoint Designer. Let's say that we do some master page customization, say, or some CSS styling. Let's say that we save that as a site template, do some stuff in Visual Studio, and then redeploy it back. You're not going to see your master page changes there, because those files, when you open them in SharePoint Designer, you customize them. So if you press F5 to deploy them back to the SharePoint root, you'll be looking for your customizations and they won't be there. The file in the database is still being used. So there's no way really to kind of to get to see your changes. And if you think that, well, okay, we could reset to the site definition for those files, don't forget that isn't going to work either, because what you'd be resetting to is what you started out with on that site def. So if you started out with a blank site def, you'd be going back to that. So the only thing you can do is actually create a new site from your template, and then the files will then be uncustomized, and you'll see the versions that you've modified. And finally, there's a bit of a gotcha with web part properties. So if you have a web part on a page and you've changed the properties of it, if you save it as a template, everything does get saved successfully, and if you then deploy it somewhere else, it will deploy successfully. But it gets saved as binary. It doesn't get saved as a nice all users web part tag that you can kind of go and change properties on. So unless you're incredibly good at binary, you're not really going to be able to work with that. Okay, so given that we've got some potential issues with this approach, some challenges, what can we do to kind of get around them? And I think the answer is don't use the project that it generates. You're going to find it difficult, really, to work with all that stuff in the project. And really, I think the way to leverage it is to perhaps pick those bits out that you want and drop them into a project that you've created. So, some things to be aware of. I think that it's still a valuable approach, and I could see that I'm probably going to use that at times. So when I want some feature XML, I want some XML for content types or fields or anything like that, I think that I'll probably use it, but you do need to be aware of some of the issues. Okay, so that's kind of some considerations in the initial build. let's kind of move on from that, and let's say that we have a site that is developed in SharePoint 2010. We want to make changes to it. The site is in use, our client is using it, there's live data in there, but we want to make changes to it to upgrade it. So, as you might have guessed, the way to do this is with upgradable features. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. Okay, so thinking about a couple of approaches for upgrading. So we've got a Visual Studio project, or many, and we've got some features that provisioned our functionality. Well, to upgrade, we could certainly create a new feature. That might be the most appropriate thing to do. And that approach is still very valid in 2010. If the most logical thing is actually to create a new feature for whatever you are adding to the site, then by all means go ahead. When we do that, you'll probably find that you'll need to staple it to a site definition so that new sites that get created inherit the feature. And somehow you'll need to activate it on the existing sites so that any sites that are already out there, they get this new functionality. So that's option one. Option two is now to use this upgradable features framework to upgrade what we've got already. So you could kind of do this in 2007. I think something that some people did was to we'll make a change to an existing feature. Maybe we'll write some code in the feature activation receiver, and then we'll make sure that we deactivate it and reactivate it, and we'll get that code to execute. That's kind of okay, but there were some issues that came with that. Some of the artifacts could be duplicated. So if you had a feature that was provisioning web parts, then you might get duplicate web parts. That was something that a lot of people ran into. But it just might be plain undesirable to run that code twice. It kind of depends on what code you've got in your feature receivers. You know, you might not have expected that that code would run twice when you wrote it the first time. So really, what you can't help but conclude is it's a bit like we needed something that wasn't the feature activation receiver that we could run and we could put code in to make changes to our existing sites. And that's really what we've got with upgradable features. Okay, so what is new in the features framework then that supports this upgrade methodology? The version attribute was always there in 2007, so on the feature node. It didn't do anything. It's a bit like Microsoft put it there and reserved it for future use, but you could change that to your heart's content and it wouldn't have any effect on anything. Now, it's absolutely critical. If you make a change to your feature, you have to increment the version number, otherwise SharePoint won't see that that feature needs upgrading. So that's kind of the first thing you do when you're trying to upgrade a feature. We've now got some new nodes under the feature node, so we've got this upgrade actions element. Within there, we can put some XML that do a small number of kind of predefined steps, and we're going to talk about those next. But the other option is we can put some XML in there that points to some code, and we can basically shell out to some code in C#, and we can put our provisioning or upgrade steps in there. So we do that with a custom upgrade actions element, and that basically points to some code in our feature upgrading method, which is a new method in the feature receiver. Okay, so we can do it in code, but we've also got some kind of convenience XML methods that Microsoft have provided. Sorry, not XML methods, XML elements. The first one is apply element manifests. So you can probably think that if you add an elements file, or whatever you like to name them, if you add an elements file to a feature, with this element you can say, at upgrade time, I want you to run this elements file and provision everything that's in there. So that way you could perhaps add an elements file to a feature that's got some fields or content types or whatever, and with that apply elements manifest, you can say, okay, now run that elements file and provision everything in there. One of the demos I was going to do was say, let's take a publishing site and we'll do an upgrade scenario where the client is saying, we need a new page layout. So for that, we need some new fields, we need a new content type, we need a new page layout, and we'll bind the layout to the content type. And I thought, yeah, that's a good upgrade scenario. Thing is, it doesn't demo very well because there really isn't much to it in the upgrade features framework. All we need is to put all that into a new elements file and use apply element manifest, and all that will provision. So it works great, it's just there's not much to it. It's very simple. One of the other things that we've got is add content type field. So this kind of does what it says on the tin. We use it for the very common scenario of adding a field to an existing content type. And the other thing that we've got is an element called mapFile. MapFile allows us to repoint a pointer in the database. So let's say that we've got a ghostable in library file, and we've got an entry in a library somewhere. Let's say it's a master page in the master page gallery. And then we've got something on the file system in the SharePoint root. MapFile allows me to change the database pointer from the path that was going to the old file to something new in a new location. I cannot get MapFile to work. If anybody in the room has this working, come and talk to me. I'd love to know how you got it working and what values you used. But that's the theory behind it anyway. So I don't know the ins and outs of it. I think there's some potential scenarios that it could be useful for, but that's the nuts and bolts of what it does. Okay, a quick word on feature dependencies. So now that we have version features, we can now depend on a specific version of a feature. And if you think about it, we needed that. It's no good having a feature dependency on any old feature if the artifacts in that feature didn't arrive until version 5. If we've got that dependency, but really what's out there is version 1, we're going to have something broken because the artifacts aren't there yet. So we've now got a minimum version attribute. Something to know about upgrading features is that if we've got feature A that depends on feature B, if we upgrade feature A and feature B also needs upgrade, that will be automatically upgraded if it's at the same scope and it also needs upgrade. And we've also got the same dependency rules as 2007, so you can't depend on a lower scope and hidden features can't have dependencies. Okay, so let's take a look at upgrading a feature. Now, I'm going to use a different site in this demo. And the reason for that is one thing I haven't talked about yet is that going back to what we saw first of all in terms of WSP input, that is, and saving as a site template, more to the point, that is still not supported for publishing sites. So you might remember that publishing sites you could not save as a site template. That is still the case in 2010. So for this demo, I'm using a publishing site, but I couldn't do that for the first one because it won't save as a site template. Okay, so let me introduce you to the site that we're using here. This is a publishing site, a SharePoint 2010 publishing site. It was actually a sample that Microsoft released for 2007, and I've kind of upgraded it to 2010. So you can see that we've got the ribbon at the top, we've got some functionality. It's not kind of completely working. You might notice I've got some CSS issues around navigation, things like that. To be honest, I don't really care about those too much. For our purposes, what I'm more interested in is that at the back end, I've got a Visual Studio solution here with all of the projects that make up that site. So really, this site has kind of been obtained by me pressing F5 in Visual Studio to deploy all these WSPs that are behind those projects and build the site up. So what we've got is not only a site that has been upgraded to 2010 in terms of what's running in IIS, but all the WSPs behind the scenes, they've also been upgraded to 2010, and they're all deployable, and all the features have the right references fixed up, and so on. Now, in terms of the site and the functionality that we're looking at in terms of upgrade, just below the fold here, we've got this area called Tourist Activities. It's a bit kind of Chris O'Brien School of Web Design at the moment, needs a bit of designer's touch. But really, all it's doing is listing out some tourist activities that are specific to this destination. Now, this AdventureWorks website, the sample, has lots of different webs for different places around the world. And in each of these webs is a tourist activities list that has some activities in specific to that destination. Now, if I go into the back end, we see the kind of things that we'd expect. We see a SharePoint list. It's got a couple of list items in. Those have a couple of fields. So they've got an activity description and an activity location. And bound to that list is a content type. If I just refresh that. So Bound to that list is a content type that has those columns. So kind of all the things that you'd expect that would support that functionality. Now, in terms of upgrade, what the business is saying to us is, okay, that's great, thanks for that. We need some new columns on this list. We need to enter some extra things against these tourist activities. And they say, so we need a column for the activity type, like whether it's a family activity, a culture activity, art or whatnot. And we need a column to say whether the activity is free. So you give us those and we'll start entering data into those columns. So as SharePoint developers, we think, okay, fine. So we'll provision a couple of fields. I guess we're going to add them to that content type. And well, yeah, that should be it, shouldn't it? So that's what we're going to do in this upgrade cycle. Okay, so in the back end, this functionality is powered by two features. It's powered by a site scoped feature called tourist activities _ site and a web scope feature called tourist activities _ web. So we've got two features because all the artifacts are scoped at different levels. So scoped at site are the fields and the content type. They live at site scope. And at the web, we've got the list definition and the list instance. They're scoped at web. So we can't have them in the same feature because we've got some artifacts of different scope. Now, it's these features that we're going to upgrade. So, step one, we've got to provision some fields. To do that, I've got to add some XML to my projects. I've got a fields folder there already. So I'm going to add a new elements file that's going to provision these new fields. So I'll pick the empty element file type, and I'm going to call this tourist activity fields iteration 2. Okay, and in here is where I would add the XML for some fields. So if I knew all the XML off the top of my head, I would go field ID equals blah. What I'm actually going to do is switch to a Visual Studio snippet to drop that in. Okay, and then we see some XML. We see a choice field being provisioned there. It's got 4 choices. And underneath that, we see a Boolean field, a yes-no field that's being provisioned. Okay, so that would provision our fields. First thing we need to do when we add new artifacts into existing Visual Studio projects is check that it went into the right feature. Visual Studio uses an algorithm to work out which of your existing features to add new things to, and it often kind of doesn't do exactly what you'd want. So we've got Packaging Explorer, which helps us out with things like this. And you see that it gets quite busy when we've got kind of 10 or 12 projects. So I'm just going to close some of these down. And what I see there is that the fields that I added went into the web scoped feature when I need them in the site scope feature. So I'm going to drag them into the site scope feature to fix that up. Okay, so we've got the actual elements file that would provision those fields. Now what we need to do is use apply elements manifest, that new node that we saw, and also add content type field to get those on our content type. So we go to the site feature. This is the feature designer that you might have seen already. I guess Eric might have talked about this. Now, feature upgrade, there's no designer support for it. We have to fall back to editing the XML ourselves. Now, in Visual Studio 2010, there's kind of a good position to be in here where we don't need to take full control of the files. What we can do is we can edit in the bottom pane here, and if I do something that's valid XML, it will be merged into the top pane. So you can hopefully see that my change got merged into the bit that Visual Studio is managing. Even better, I can actually switch to a fully fledged XML editor, which gives me IntelliSense and so on. So we are editing the file here, which really corresponds to the feature.xml file. First thing we need to do is add a version attribute. Currently, this feature doesn't have one. When a feature doesn't have a version attribute, it defaults to 0000. By me setting it to 100, I am upgrading the feature. Okay, so under here, I now need some upgrade actions. And what I need to do is say what version range these upgrade actions apply to. So I'm going to say that any feature that's out there in the wild that is between 000 and 0999, so anything before what we're going to here, we're going to do these upgrade actions. So you probably can't see the IntelliSense that's appearing, but what I've got there is add content type field and apply element manifests. So these are the things that I need to put in my feature file. Now, what I'm going to do is drop those in via a snippet, because it's a fair chunk of XML. Okay, and if we look at those, what we've basically got is apply elements manifest that's pointing to our new elements file, and we've got two add content type field nodes which have the right IDs in for the content type and the field, and also have push down equals true. And that will make sure that all the list content types they basically inherit these new columns. So it's pushed out from the site content type to all the lists that use it. Okay, so we have added our XML to the feature XML node. What we need to do now is deploy that. And I'm going to make sure that Visual Studio is set to upgrade when I deploy. So that's the equivalent of doing an STS-ADM upgrade solution, which is all I need to do. Okay, so we'll deploy that, and Visual Studio says succeeded. So I've got my content type. Okay, so I want to check that you're all following. Somebody tell me what we're expecting to see on this content type now. Two fields. You would think so, wouldn't you? Sorry, trick question. When this comes back, you'll see that we have got no change. Nothing has changed there. The reason for this is because feature upgrade does not happen by the act of pushing out the solution. So whether you do upgrade solution or whether you do retract, deactivate, and then add, redeploy, neither of those will run feature upgrade. So the page reloaded, we don't have our new columns. So feature upgrade is something you have to run yourself. Now, interestingly, there is no UI for feature upgrade. There is no STS-ADM command for feature upgrade. There is no PowerShell commandlet. The only thing that's in there is basically methods in the API that run this for you. So you have to write code to upgrade your features. Now, there's obviously, you can do that in a console app or whatever you want to do. I have a custom app page that I developed. So under there, you see a new option called Manage Feature Upgrades. And this is what I've been using to upgrade my features. And what this does is this allows me to basically select the scope of the features to look for that need upgrade. So the other thing I should mention here is there is, as well as the method to upgrade features, which is spfeature.upgrade, new method on the feature class, we also have other new methods called query features. These exist at different levels. So spsite, for example, has query features. Also, objects above that, like to find farm and web app scope features. These will return a collection of features that need upgrade based on you changing that version number. And this is what my custom page here is doing. So I'm going to say, yeah, I want to search for site scoped features, and I want to search for only features requiring upgrade. And that's come back with one feature, and the parent is adventureworks.test, and over here the feature name is touristactivities_site. So it's realized that our site scope feature needs upgrade. And over here we've got a checkbox to say whether we want to upgrade it and an upgrade features button. So yes, I do want to upgrade that feature, please. And that says, yeah, that upgrade is successfully. So now let's go take a look at our content type. And yes, indeed, our new columns are indeed there. So that's the thing you have to do. You have to trigger your feature upgrade somehow. It's not going to happen just by updating the solution. Which makes sense when you think about it. Let's say that you've got a web-scoped feature and you've got 1,000 webs out there in your farm. Do you really want to update it across all 1,000? Maybe you want more control. Maybe you want to roll it out gradually. You want to do it 10 at a time, or some businesses aren't ready for your new functionality. So that's why you've kind of got some control by the fact that it doesn't happen automatically. Okay, and then if we go to our list, we should see that if things push down successfully, our list items have the new columns and they can accept data. So yes, there we go. We've got the new columns on our list items. So happy days. That is a feature upgrade. That is the cycle that you go through. Now, we talked about the fact that you've got two ways to upgrade features. We've got some XML elements like apply element manifests, and we've got the other one which is add content type field. What if whatever you want to do doesn't get covered by that stuff? You need to shell out to code, basically. You need to write code that is going to do whatever it is you need to do. Obviously, in terms of code, the world's your oyster. You can do whatever you want. On this next upgrade cycle, we're going to show code, and the scenario that we've got is that the business are now saying, okay, thanks for those new two columns. They're great. We're using them. We are entering data into them. The one thing we notice is that when we are creating our tourist activities, this description field that we've got is too small. We can't fit the stuff in that we want to fit in. So as SharePoint developers, we go take a look at that and we see, oh yeah, it's a single line of text field. They're not really going to fit too much into that. So it's clear that what they need really is a note field instead, so something that will allow them to fit more data in. So we think, how would we upgrade that? How would we upgrade a single line of text field to a note field? And the answer is, well, you can't really. You can't change the schema type of a field that's in use. So as creative SharePoint developers, we think, okay, so what we could do instead, we could provision a new field. We could copy the data out for every list item into the new field, and then we'll mark the old one as hidden. So that's kind of upgrading our field. So it's a bit more complex. This one needs code, so that's what we're going to do. So back into Visual Studio then. What we're going to do here is a few steps. So we need a new field again, so we've got to repeat that step. We need it added to the content type again, so we need that step. So let's do those first. In our fields folder, I'm going to add another elements file that has the new field in. So I'm going to call this Tourist Activity Fields Iteration 3. And I'm going to use a snippet to drop the right XML in. Okay, so here is our note field being provisioned. It's got a display name of activity description large, so we can see it in our demo. We need to do the thing in Packaging Explorer again, which checked that it went into the site scope feature. Now it went into the web one, so we'll put it in the site scope one. And then we need to go back to the kind of the feature.xml type file to do the same trick again of using apply elements manifest to run that new file, and also add content type field. So we're upgrading this site scope feature. First thing we need to do, increment the version number. I'm going to change it from 100 to 200. In the next session tomorrow, we talk a bit about strategies for using these numbers. Which one do you upgrade? Do you change the first one? Do you change the last one? Something in between. That's something we talk about. And having changed the feature number, we do a new version range. And we say that anything that's within version 100 to, say, 1999, we want you to do these steps. Okay, now we've got to do the same thing again. We've got to do the add content type field and apply element manifest. So I'm just going to drop that in with a snippet. So far, so similar to the last demo. Not done anything new yet. Okay, so that's the apply elements manifest and the add content type field. And that's the site stuff that we need to do. Now we need to go to our web feature. We've got to write code now to do that business of copying the list value, the value from one field to the other. We need to do this at the web feature, not in the site feature, because the list instance is basically, it's scoped at web. We've got well, I know for a fact that we've got 4 or 5 instances of this feature and this web and this list that are around. So what we need to do is write the code in there so that it processes for each one of these instances. So we go find the web feature. And there's 2 elements to what we need to do to this feature. We need to add some XML in the same way that we did for the other bits of feature upgrade. And we need to write some code. Okay, so in this feature, we need to add a version number. We haven't touched this one yet. We haven't upgraded it. So here, we add the version number. And now we do upgrade actions. And here is where we are doing something new. We're using a new element that we haven't looked at yet, custom upgrade action. And this basically points to some code somewhere. And in fact, what I've got to do is, I've got a snippet, I think, for this. So I'll show you what we end up with. Okay, so little comment to me there that I have to remember that this one goes in the web feature. What we see there is a name. This custom upgrade action has a name. Now that is going to tie up to some code that we're going to write. And we see that we pass parameters to it. And what we're passing is the content type name that we're interested in and the 2 fields, the old one and the new one. Our code is going to consume this stuff. Now, a little fact, kids, that feature upgrade bombs if you leave an XML comment in your files. So we have to take that out. That might be a pre-RTM bug, I don't know, but it does mean that you can't have comments in these XML files. Okay, so that's the XML bit. What we need now is code. Now this feature does not yet have an event receiver, so we're going to add one. Now, you should recognize this class. It's just a feature receiver. The one thing that's different is that it has a new method on the end called feature upgrading. So we're going to comment that back in. And feature upgrading receives some parameters. It receives some properties. You remember that we defined properties in the XML. It receives an upgrade action name. We defined that in the XML. And it receives some other parameters that we can make use of. So what we would do in here is we would get a reference to the parent. Properties.feature .parent. We would cast that to be an SP web because we know this is a web feature. I like to do an unsafe cast there so I know if anything changes. And then we would test the upgrade action name that gets passed. And we know that we use something, I think it was migrate to large description field. That was our name. Now, you can see here that what's going to happen over time is we're going to revisit this method. Every time we upgrade it, we're going to come back in here and we're going to add some new chunk of code to process this particular upgrade. So I guess what we need really is a switch statement because we're going to stack these up over time, probably better than an if statement. So what I'm going to do is, we've got a chunk of code here, so I'm going to drop it in with a snippet. Okay, let's take a quick look through this. I've got a reference to fix up there. Okay, so what are we doing? We are testing that the upgrade action name is migrate to large description field. We're collecting the parameters that we passed in, so that kind of just allows me to avoid hard coding some stuff in my in my C# code. And then we find all the lists in the current web that is being upgraded that match what we're looking for. So we find everything that is using this content type, and then we iterate through the list items, and we copy the old value from the old field and drop it into the new one. Finally, we mark the field as hidden, and then we should be good. So that's kind of our XML talking to our code, and this is hopefully going to run when we upgrade the feature. So what we need to do is we need to deploy this WSP. And we've learned the lesson now that deploying this does not trigger feature upgrade. That doesn't do anything itself. So we're going to need to go back to our feature upgrade page. So this is going to be on Codeplex if anybody's doing this stuff and They want this to help them out with their feature upgrade. Probably what I'll do is I'll do an equivalent for central admin for farm and web scope features. And if I can, I'll probably do a PowerShell commandlet as well for those scenarios. Okay, so the deploy succeeded. Okay, so we've got to upgrade 2 features now. We've got to upgrade the site one. There we go. So that's upgrade running. And now we query for web features that need upgrade. And as I say, we've got multiple instances of this web feature that's out there in the wild. Those are the webs that we've got. So it's the different destination guides in our AdventureWorks website. They all need upgrading. So I'm going to leave all the checkboxes checked, and we're going to upgrade all those web features. So it's going around all the webs now, and it's processing the XML that we defined, and it's running the code that we specified in our feature upgrading event. So that's hopefully going to come back and say that they all succeeded. Quick fact, the return type of spfeature.upgrade is an IEnumerable of exceptions. So it's not like anything can go wrong. Okay, so that's being a bit slow for some reason. Okay, but what? Oh, the VM's frozen. Oh, right at a critical point. That was so exciting. Oh, okay, so the VM's died. So what we would have seen, is that we should have the new field provisioned on our content type. It would be big, which is what the content authors asked for. It would have copied the old value into that new big field, and it would have marked the new one as hidden. Sorry, the old one as hidden. So that's basically the combination of XML being used to upgrade features and also code. So I think we do a recap of that in tomorrow's session, so we might get to see it working then. Okay, so quick wrap up then. I think we've seen 2 iterations of feature upgrade. Main things are, it doesn't happen automatically. You need to run query features to find the ones that need upgrade, and then spfeature.upgrade. You can use my page if that's useful to you. Some gotchas. If you're doing this stuff, there's some messages that don't get logged to ULS by default. You need to bump up the logging for those 3 categories there. That's going to help you out. Begin version is inclusive, but end version isn't. So just think about that when you're doing your version ranges. That's something that can catch you out. Tricky one to think about. What happens if, in some features, you do lots of upgrades, you start off at version 0.0.0, and then you end up at 4.0.0.0. What happens if you activate that feature that's at 4.0.0 directly for the first time on a new site? Your upgrade stuff won't have run. So what happens there is you do get the provision stuff in XML, that stuff will be there, but any code, that won't have run. So perhaps you need to think about calling the code in the feature activation event, in feature activating, as well as in feature upgrading. So a bit of care that's needed in designing your features here. Also, make sure that you obey the elements by scope rules for different artifacts. If you don't, well, it basically seems that the upgrade code is more pernickety than SharePoint's initial provisioning code. So again, you can get yourself into problems there that are difficult to diagnose. Okay, so just some quick things to finish off. We saw that WSP import can be useful in the initial build, and hopefully you agree with me that that's something that you might make use of. But in terms of upgrade, we've got a standardized framework now. We've got, we can do this the XML route with things like add field to content type, and we can do it the code route with the feature upgrading event. We saw one example of each, so we saw 2 different ways to upgrade features. Next time, we think about different artifacts and how they might upgrade. So how do I upgrade a content type that's in use? How do I upgrade a list template that's in use? What are the things that I might need to think about for different artifacts? We think about solution framework and changes there. And also versioning assemblies. So that thing where we worked out that probably 90%, or that's my theory anyway, 90% of the SharePoint 2007 installations that are out there, all of the custom assemblies are still at version 1.0.0.0 because assembly versioning was difficult in SharePoint 2007. We'll look at what 2010 does to improve that situation, and we'll finish off with some recommendations, both for features, what are the things that we could think about when versioning feature numbers, but also for assemblies as well. Okay, so hopefully you can join me tomorrow. That's Tuesday at 11:45. Hope that was useful, and if you've got any questions, then fire away. Yeah. Yeah. There is no, so the question was, what can we do about rolling back? There is no support for rolling back. All you could do, I think, is probably iterate again, increment, and write code that is effectively your undo code. There's nothing transactional about this. There is nothing that kind of saves the state that you are currently in, so you have to deal with it all yourself. Yep.
If you want to do a big atomic push out, can you hook into any solution upgrade code? Is there any new events for that?
I talk about that tomorrow. So you mean something like a solution receiver? Yeah. It's like an event that, you know, solution being added, solution being deployed. No. It really kills me that they didn't put that in there. I know for a fact that it was on the design board, it was nearly in the product, and they cut it out at the last minute, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, we talk about that and other things that we could have used that for tomorrow. So unfortunately, that's not in there now. Yep.
You had no version range on the custom upgrade action. Is that intentionally?
Possibly not. So if I did that, what happens if you don't have a version range is that will execute every time you upgrade. So I didn't mean to do that, but it kind of worked because it will work all the time, if you know what I mean. So that is one way that if you wanted to run something regardless of what version range it was, and you wanted to run it for every upgrade, you can have it outside of a version range element, and it will always run.
But you can also have the custom upgrade within a version range.
Absolutely, yeah, and more often than not, you would, yeah. Yep. Okay, I think that's it. So hopefully you can join me tomorrow. Thanks for coming. Thank you.